Mikhail Leonidovich, hello?
Alexei, I recognized you by your voice. Hello.
That's wonderful.
I can't see.
Well, all right, we can all see you just fine. So in that regard, everything's good. We'll mostly communicate with you verbally. Well, I know how, so to speak, skeptical you are about the forecasts and calculations of various international organizations. For example, I don't even know about this one, the Bank for International Settlements. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Of course.
I just want to use these words as a starting point to talk globally about the world economy, but also specifically. Yeah, great. So, the experts from this financial institution say that the world economy is at a turning point right now. That's what caught my attention. And secondly, that protectionism and fragmentation are thriving, or maybe even playing a dominant role. So, in this regard, I have a question for you, not about their conclusions, although if you want, of course, you can touch on them, right? But in general, when all of this is over, assuming, of course, that we're not all turned to dust and are still alive and more or less healthy, what will the world economy look like? That's my simple little question for you, just for 30 seconds.
I have a hypothesis that they read the book The Decline of the Dollar Empire and the End of the American Pax, which was published in 2003, that is, 22 years ago. That book was precisely about how the consequences of this crisis would be the fragmentation of the global currency zone, and, accordingly, that protectionist policies would play a key role. I'm glad they managed to read the book after 22 years. It kind of warms my heart. Although, I don't rule out another possibility. The thing is, later on, in 2019, another book came out called Memories of the Future, and it was translated here into American English. Maybe, apparently, they read that one. That's it. But then they're fools, because everything written there, in that part, was already written back in 2003.
Well, there you go.
All right, why should we bother with them anyway? So, you're going to laugh. On Saturday, that is, the day before yesterday, my regular show Economics in Russian aired on Solovyov Live, where I spent an entire hour talking about the consequences of this crisis. Since we don't have an entire hour here, I will have to keep this discussion brief and directly to the point.
It's like how Americans cram war and peace into 30-page pamphlets, right?
30 pages is a lot. You can write a lot in 30 pages. But try squeezing it into just 3 pages.
They can do it. To Save is one of their classics.
Yeah, no, it's possible. So, light. Anyway, here's the thing. It's like that famous joke about 2 people sitting together, and one of them is reading a thick book. So, one asks the other, "What book is that?" He says, "Oh, it's an amazing, fascinating book. What a plot. So many characters." At that moment, an orderly in a white coat walks into the room and says, "Lunatics. And why did you erase the phone book again?"
Yeah, and the advertising brochures too, I see.
Yeah. So, here's the thing. Here's what it's all about. The entire global economy, since the early 80s, has been built on stimulating demand. As a result of this, because of this excessive demand, they built up an absolutely colossal amount of excess capacity, and at the same time wildly distorted the structure of the economy. The point isn't even that there are now surplus industries that maybe nobody needs. The thing is, even the industries that are actually needed, let's say, for example, they should be producing 100 million units of something, but instead they're making 200 million. The problem is that any kind of production is built on infrastructure, and that infrastructure is clearly excessive. So, in the midst of a severe crisis, no one is going to finance this surplus infrastructure. But there's also no money to build new infrastructure either. Well, let's say, this is an example I've used many times. Imagine that in a certain town, right in the center, in the downtown area, there are 4 skyscrapers. And for any skyscraper to be profitable, it needs to be at least 60% occupied. These 4 are 80% full. And everything's great. Everyone's making a profit. All the major companies are in nice offices. It's perfect, just beautiful. Then a crisis hits, and as a result, everything drops by half. So now, each skyscraper is only 40% occupied. And that means it's not profitable anymore.
So you need to get rid of one, right?
2.
Even two.
Yeah, because then each of the 2 ends up with 0.8. But the problem is that the electricity, water supply, and everything else were set up for 4 skyscrapers. If you shut down 2, then electricity and water become much more expensive for the remaining 2. Besides, can you imagine what it's like to have 2 empty skyscrapers just standing there? You know, in the southwest of Moscow there was that Bluetooth building standing there, yeah, since the late. When they started building it, I was still.
There's a huge unfinished residential building next to it. I think about 30 stories tall.
In the late 90s, right?
Yeah, there's one like that.
Yeah, that's where homeless people start moving in, and all sorts of trouble begins. Well, sure, you can lock out the homeless completely, but you still have to clean up the place afterwards. If you don't clean a skyscraper, let's be honest, it starts to look pretty bad. Somewhere along the way, windows start getting broken. So basically, everything just goes downhill. And then you have 2 options. Either you raise the price in these 2 to make up for all of this. But as soon as you raise the price, your occupancy drops again. So this is a real problem. And there's no solution to it. Yes, this is a real, very serious problem. So, our comprehensive analysis clearly indicates that if the United States had initiated proactive measures to address this critical issue much earlier, specifically starting back in the pivotal year 2000, they would have been compelled to implement substantial reductions in their overall consumption, amounting to approximately 40% of their total usage, in order to mitigate the problem effectively. Well, fine, 35%, a third. Instead, they pretended nothing was wrong and blamed everything on bin Laden. That's actually why, on September 10th, 2001, I wrote about the possibility of major terrorist attacks. And so, after that, everyone dragged things out until 2008 and then stretched it even further up to today. As a result, the decline will be 55 to 60%. Not even 50, but more like 55 to 60. As a result, you'll be facing a very serious problem. First of all, the middle class will disappear. Because the middle class consists of people with typical consumer behavior, and it was created en masse thanks to Reaganomics, starting from the early 80s. But that's already 2 generations. In other words, people who have already retired, or, well, are about to retire. They no longer remember what it was like before Reaganomics. Well, it's about the same as if I, at 63, started recalling how the Soviet economy was organized in the 70s. Well, I graduated from school in 1979, from school number 179 in 1979. The question is, what do you do with that? I don't really understand how everything was set up back then. I know on the surface, sure, that a good loaf of bread cost 25 kopecks. And you can't find a loaf like that in Moscow these days. In terms of quality,
I remember the ice cream, but not so much the bread. A quarter loaf of rye bread costs 5 kopecks.
Yeah. A loaf of rye bread cost 20 kopecks, and Borodinsky, I think, was 22 kopecks. I don't remember. So here's the picture. And so that's already 2 generations, right? I mean, people who were born in 1980 could theoretically already have grandkids. They're still little grandkids, but it's possible. And now they already think that getting this extra money is just normal. They're used to being middle class, but there won't be any money for the middle class. And half the country's population will fall into poverty. Poverty itself, well, that's not so scary. People live, survive, and so on. But when you're middle class, I mean, the middle class is the backbone of the electorate. These are people who not only have typical consumer behavior, but also typical political behavior. And, well, all sorts of problems will start. I won't get into the details right now, but you can check out Economics in Russian. I've already posted links on my Telegram channels, and it's already on YouTube, so in that sense, everything's all set. On my channels. So, there's another problem. So, two problems. First, infrastructure, and second, the disappearance of the middle class. The third problem is another socio-political one. The standard of living will drop to the level of the 1920s in the United States of America.
Well, that's just food and a bit of clothing, and that's it, right?
And pants, yeah. But back then, the rural population, meaning those who provided their own food, that is, either they themselves had a garden or a vegetable patch where they grew their own food, and they also had cows, horses, sheep, goats, and so on. Or they served others, well, roughly speaking, as a veterinarian, right? A veterinarian might not even keep cows himself, because all the owners of the cows he treated would always give him some milk. How much does he need per day? 2 liters? 3 liters?
So, in simpler terms, it's a subsistence economy.
Well, basically, yes. And more than 50% of the population in the US used to live like this, but today it's only 4%. Can you imagine relocating city hipsters to the countryside? It's impossible. They have no idea what that's like. Our people still remember how to grow potatoes.
They still remember, and some even grow them.
Yes, they do. But here, you also have to find the right kind of potatoes, because if you take Israeli potatoes or some other kind, if you plant them in the ground, they'll just rot and won't grow. You need a different kind of potato. That's it. And so on and so forth. Of course, we do have seed farms in the country, not many, but they exist. But there aren't enough for everyone if suddenly everybody wants to plant. That's it. Although, you know, there are all sorts of stories. For example, I've been getting my hair cut by the same person for 30 years, someone from a village. And every year for the May holidays, he goes to his village, a village he hasn't lived in for about 30 years. He plants potatoes because that's sacred. That's how it is. So, that's the third problem, the change in the structure of society. And finally, the fourth is the change in the socio-political structure of society, because instead of a middle class, there will be poor people, and society's structure will collapse into something like the picture in Latin America. And that will also bring very big problems. Basically, all of this will happen, it will all happen. We'll see all of this in the next 8 to 10 years. There. In our country, things are different. First of all, with the right policy, we can. You know, I won't even repeat myself now. I wrote about this 2 years ago, and 23, when they started raising the rate, and 5 years ago, and 10 years ago, and 20 years ago. I've written about all this, so I won't repeat myself. We can reach a pretty decent growth rate, somewhere around 12 to 15% a year, for about 20 to 25 years. At the same time, of course, we need to expand our sphere of economic influence, the Ruble zone, and so on. And so on. This needs to be done. But accordingly, so far, this isn't happening, right? For now, we see titanic efforts to keep us in the liberal sphere. Well, let's see what comes of it, right? So, once again, theoretically, we can achieve economic growth. Well, God will.
Well, if we go back to the situation, it turns out that fragmentation is a way to survive, because you have to somehow distance yourself from your fellow planet dweller who's thinking, or say, your adversary on the planet.
This is our fragmentation. By the way, Alexei, actually, remember our conversations when we used to talk on Echo of Moscow about 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, that happened, sure.
See, I was talking about all this back then.
We did talk about it, yes, and people laughed at you, that's true. You see, here's the thing. Everything is heading exactly where you said it would. But it was just the timing of when all this would happen. That was probably the whole reason, or, I don't know, the excuse for, not the excuse, but how should I put it, the opportunity for some irony.
You see, and here's the thing, I've explained this many times too. The thing is, they could have started all this back then, even in the year 2000. Why didn't it work out for them? Because they chose the wrong model. They kept postponing the crisis at the cost of making it worse. You know, I've come across this kind of situation a couple of times in my life. There's this woman, right, she's still relatively young, just a bit over 40. She finds a small lump in her breast, and instead of rushing to the doctor, she says, "Oh no, what if it's something serious? I won't go." You see what I mean? Then she finally goes, and on the one hand, it might just be some harmless cyst, thank God for that. In that case, the only difference is that the scar will be bigger, right? At the early stage, the scar would have been small, but now it ends up being large. And in another scenario, if it's cancer, what could have been cut out and completely removed now becomes the cause of death, right? So basically, that's exactly what they did. They committed suicide. Who's to blame for that? Partly because instead of listening to what they were being told, I wasn't the only one saying it. Instead, they just laughed. Oh, this city madman, he doesn't understand anything. But now it's clear that even back then, they understood, 25 years ago. But they just didn't listen. So what now? As my dad used to say, write a statement on yourself.
Well, you know, the main thing is not to end up like Karandashev, right? Like, if I can't have you, no one can, so they don't drag everyone else down with them. And here's the question. They're still flailing around. Sorry for getting into specifics, but you know, that notorious 500%. The terrorist, extremist Lindsey Graham, yeah, the one who played golf with Trump. And supposedly Trump said, well, all right, let's go. It's time to move on. Yeah, but here's what I find interesting. I can see you're smiling, right? But okay.
Nobody knows, whether he said it or not.
Yeah, we've also watched all the movies about Grishka the Pretender at the Lithuanian border. Here's what I'm curious about. Specifically, the question of India in this situation. China might, you know, most likely try to wriggle out, and it is wriggling and standing its ground firmly. But what about India? What can you say about that country?
The thing is, this is a country that is a market unto itself. There are two countries in the world that are their own markets, China and India. But
Not the U anymore?
who?
The U? Not anymore. Got it. No, 500 million? 500 million.
The population is about that, yes, but it's not about the population. Let me explain. So, China has not just exhausted the potential of its domestic market, it has gone way beyond that. So, China was making super profits from selling to the US, and it was using those super profits to raise the incomes of its citizens. Everything was great. But if the US disappears as a market, then an economic catastrophe of about the same scale as in the United States begins there. And as for the European Union, it's even worse there, because, by the way, if you compare the relationship between northern and southern China, those relations might actually be even worse than those between different countries in the European Union. But the problem is that, formally, the countries of the European Union are economically and politically independent, yet they have to fulfill the obligations they've taken on themselves. Like everyone putting money into the Brussels pot, and Brussels distributing it fairly to everyone. But now, suddenly, it turns out that Brussels.
And Brussels is giving it to Ukraine.
Exactly. And Brussels is sending it who knows where. They're planning to launch military programs there, and other things too. And naturally, people are saying, why should our people, my citizens, if I'm a politician, the citizens of my country, have to go hungry so that officials in Brussels can take kickbacks from defense contracts? They know exactly what kind of kickbacks those are. The people might not know, but the politicians are asking, where's our cut? And they're told, who are you, anyway? And they respond, oh, is that how it is? Well then, we won't vote for it. That's exactly what Orban and Fico were doing, putting on a show. And there will be more like them soon, just wait. Of course, in Brussels they're trying to get rid of anyone who resists. But I can assure you, as people's control over their own lives grows, all of this will only intensify, intensify, and intensify. So they'll fall apart. It'll all die off like last year's snow.
Well, we have about a minute left, maybe a minute and a half. Yes, but still, if we go back to India. So how is India going to behave in the end?
India isn't going to behave in any particular way. It will simply ignore everyone and calmly develop its internal economy. And it'll be friends with everyone, friends with Russia, friends with the US, friends with the European Union while it still exists, friends with everyone. You see, it's a very unique country. I want to say that, by the way, it's actually very similar to the European Union and nothing like today's Russia or today's China. First of all, because India isn't even a federation, it's a confederation. There, the rights of each state are greater than those of the federal government. But they all know for sure that they are India. Moreover, they also have a complicated relationship with Pakistan. That's it. So things there are really quite non-trivial, very much so.
Yeah, and both Southerners and Northerners there barely understand each other, even when it comes to language.
Well, they don't understand each other, yet. Of course, obviously, even in neighboring states, people might not understand each other. That's why I think they'll just keep developing at their own pace. I mean, they generally don't really go beyond their own territory. Although, for example, they're quite active in Africa, like Madagascar and the whole eastern region.
If you don't count Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so on. Those are also, in a way, their former territories. So, I have a question. After the start of the special military operation, we were really helped by the fact that, as you mentioned in the first part, the Chinese economy took off not without the help of the Americans, right? And China, as a major country, became a serious consumer of our energy resources. We were able to redirect the flows, meaning we basically found a new market. But couldn't Africa or, say, the Asia-Pacific region become a new market? Those areas have very dense populations. Maybe, if people's economic situation improves, they could start buying goods, consuming energy, setting up production? Or do you not consider that scenario?
No, why not? It's entirely possible. I think that, in fact, our zone, our sphere of influence, will expand significantly. Yeah, but we'll see how it goes. So, we need about 500 million people. They are basically out there. I think that in about 20 years, well, I hope I'll still be around. Yeah. These days, 83 years old isn't really old.
And I sincerely wish you that, absolutely. Just as I wish it for myself, by the way.
Yes, yes, yes. By the way, Alexei, sorry, how old are you?
I'm 59. Born in 65. We're almost the same age, yeah?
Let's say we're the same age. Yeah. Well then, in that case, in about 20 years, you and I will see for ourselves that while the geographical map probably won't change, the political one will change a lot. I mean, when will it be? But really, it should be a little bit different, right? Because if you remember, in the days of our youth, on the political maps of the world, there were pieces that were colored the same as the main colonial countries.
Yes.
Portugal. I remember the time when Angola and Mozambique were Portuguese colonies. Yes, there were all sorts of stories, all kinds of things. And the maps from the 50s, those were something else entirely. But now it's going to be a bit different, because it won't be colonies, but rather currency zones. For example, I have a hypothesis that in, say, 20 years, Japan will be part of the Ruble currency zone.
Wow.
Actually, I really love that country. The last time I was there was last summer. So, for us as well, by the way, it's a really amazing thing. Yes, there are all these sanctions and whatnot, but when people apply for visas at the Japanese embassy, do you know what they're told? They're told, come back in 3 days. They ask, but what if something comes up? And they're told, nothing ever comes up. Your visa will be ready in 3 days.
So, they want to see people.
I don't know of any cases where people have been denied a Japanese visa. But with EU visas, there are some countries that have stopped issuing them altogether. They drag things out for a really long time, and they're starting to undermine the Schengen Agreement. Try flying to Germany today with a Schengen visa. There's a good chance your visa will be canceled and you'll be deported.
So, a Schengen visa obtained in another country, like, say, in France, right?
Yes, in France, in Italy. They're just being nasty. At the same time, they can take 2 or 3 months to issue that Schengen visa. It's ridiculous, isn't it? Yeah, well, it's clear, right? They're planning to declare war on US. That's obvious. They're saying it openly. In 29, Drang knock Austin. Yeah, that way. You know, it would be funny if it weren't so sad. They won't be able to do it for economic reasons, but their desire is already
Grown.
grown. Exactly. You know what it's like? It's very much like when enthusiastic amateur fishermen proudly show off the impressive pike they successfully caught just last week, perhaps even a few days ago.
Yeah, their arms just aren't long enough to show how big it was. Yeah. So, after all, Japan is kind of, I don't want to offend this great nation in terms of culture and everything, but isn't it kind of like a little lapdog at the feet of the United States? Or not? How are they supposed to break away from that foot?
That's why I said 20 years. Because the United States simply doesn't have the resources to keep holding on to Japan. So, like, if Japan says, we want to develop, we need this and that, and then there's Russia, all this stuff, what are you going to do? It's going to happen very slowly.
As far as I remember, they're not the main holder of American bonds yet.
Yeah, but they've already started saying that they should start selling those bonds, because over there,
Just yesterday, in fact.
economic problems. It's actually really funny over there, isn't it? It's a very unique country. I've already said that, psychologically, it's like a big Russian village. And this village mentality, it just seeps out of every crack over there. When city people go there, they lose their minds. They can't handle it. I mean, it's just impossible, right? But on the other hand, people who like living in the countryside, they say, oh, it's wonderful, just lovely, absolutely lovely. So my daughter decided to go there. And she says, Dad, you know, Alexei, all that stuff about there being 125 people in a small area, she says, I want to go there. I know the place.
Well, that's not true. I've been there too.
Yeah, it's empty there. So she wants to go to Tokyo. Technically, it's part of Tokyo. There are islands in Tokyo Bay where, across all the islands, only about 150 people live, and you can walk around there. There are volcanoes and other things. You can walk for hours and not meet a single person.
Well, yeah, But they're also used to hearing all sorts of stories about us that aren't actually true.
By the way, they don't believe them. They don't believe them. Yeah. But I can say one thing. When, on February 24th, 2022, Asia was still in Tokyo, when it all started, three of her, well, the Ukrainians there started organizing rallies in Tokyo. Three of her male friends called her, all from completely different professions. One was an artist, one a programmer, and I don't even remember who the third was. And they said, Asia, we've gathered some guys here. Let's go beat up the Ukrainians. Wait, if you all gather, there won't be enough Ukrainians for all of Japan. They said, yeah, well, we're ready anyway. There you go. That's the story.
Let's write it down. Mikhail Leonidovich, let's write it down. Japan in the Ruble zone. And then, well, we have a long history of talking with each other. There will be two little mushrooms like that sitting, I hope, on air. And back then, you were saying. But if we move on to our own, so to speak, lambs, today we were talking about all sorts of animals. So, Herman Greff said that the 26th year will be a tough one for business and for banks. And when I heard that phrase of his, I thought, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like for some reason banks are being given some kind of extraordinary preferential treatment right now. Or not. I could be mistaken. They'd had some insane profits for the second year in a row, which are equal to our budget deficit. Well, that's 3.8 trillion rubles. But what if we just didn't have any deficit at all?
So that's the whole trick. The crucial thing is, they have set such an incredibly high interest rate on their citizens' deposits that they've accumulated, 60 or perhaps even 70 trillion rubles in these substantial deposits. Where are they supposed to get the money to pay out all that interest? And so, accordingly, if they suddenly start lowering the rate, and if there's a change in the central bank's leadership, which is bound to happen. Now, various experts are already writing that for the economy to develop normally, for it to start growing, the rate needs to be 7%. So, accordingly, they'll lower the rate, and people will rush to withdraw their money. Okay, maybe they won't withdraw 70 trillion. Maybe they'll take out 40. So where are the banks supposed to get those 40 trillion from? They simply don't have those 40 trillion. If they try to sell assets on the market, first of all the assets will crash in value, right? And then, accordingly, those 40 trillion still won't be there.
Sorry to interrupt, but why would they, or rather, why would we rush to withdraw anything? I mean, I personally wouldn't. Where would you even put it? Under the mattress or something? Where does all that money even go?
Well, people are strange creatures. They say, oh, you bastards, huh? So you're stuffing yourselves here. You used to pay 20%, and now you pay 7. No, give me my money back. Aye, it's none of your business where. I'll just keep it under the mattress, or I'll buy gold with it. No gold.
Well, they'll end up buying that gold from the banks too.
Well, fine, whether they buy it from banks or not.
From whom then? From gold prospectors in Magadan?
No, why would they? There are already companies that trade in gold. In Moscow, for sure. And they actually trade better than the banks. Their spread, that is, the difference between the buying and selling price, is smaller than the banks. It doesn't matter. If the interest rate drops sharply, I assure you, people will start withdrawing their money. They'll say, oh, it's time to buy an apartment, right? And if you also consider that apartment prices are about to start falling, whoa. Right? So, you'd think, what difference does it make to the banks? You give out the money, so the client takes that money, pays the apartment seller, and the seller gets it in their account. But nope. Because the apartment seller says, oh ho ho, there's not much left for us in Russia. Huh, I'd better convert all this to dollars.
Well, I don't know. I'm just trying it on myself, personally. Who else would I try it on? I'm not going to do anything at all, not even make a move. I'll tell you more. I don't really like the current rate. I get that I end up with more money when, the interest is added, but it scares me. I'd rather it be a bit less. Maybe I'm an idiot, of course, but that's just how I feel.
There's one thing here, right? Let me tell you a big secret. The vast majority of men who earn money don't even think about this at all.
Exactly, yeah?
It's their wives who think about it. And the logic of wives, well, it's a bit special. It's like, do you know what women's logic is? If a leads to be, and B feels good, then A must be true. That's precisely why you really kind of need to be very careful here. Isn't that right? Someone might want to dig themselves a little pond on their plot. And for that, of course, you'll have to spend some money. And that's how the economy will develop. Because then you'll need an excavator, a tractor, maybe something else, back and forth. And someone else might decide, why not go to the Maldives? So, I had some money just sitting there, earning me 20%, and I ended up with a crazy amount of cash. I still don't have time to do anything with it. I've got an apartment.
Can't buy another one, but it's enough for the Maldives.
It's enough for the Maldives, right? And I'll go to the Maldives. So there was money in the country, and now there's no money. So, you see, it's all pretty complicated. I mean, in this sense, do you get what I'm saying? Bref, that's the whole problem, right? If he had just kept the money he'd been getting over the past 3 years, to pay out in case something happened, he wouldn't have any problems. But instead, he paid out dividends, including to former partners. How many foreign shareholders does Spare have, anyway? Some went here, some went there. And that's how life's complications start. We actually have banks that are less successful than Spare. And in some of them, there are little holes in the balance sheets. Let's put it that way. As long as everything's fine, you don't see them. But as soon as people start withdrawing their deposits, that's when it all kicks off.
I have another layman's question on this topic. Look, we have a budget rule for oil companies. So if the oil price suddenly changes in a way that benefits them, and they make some extra profit, then various interesting mechanisms kick in that are useful for the state budget. But is there anything like that for banks or not?
No, not at all.
And why is that? That's exactly what I've been telling you from the very beginning.
I can tell you why. Because basically, oil companies are living off Soviet-era infrastructure. And bankers and privatizers are one team. They're the ones in power. And that's why they write the laws in a way that suits them. By the way, I actually think they're going to start having problems with this soon. I mean, they'll start raising taxes on banks. Next, here's what's going to happen. The banks will say, we don't have any money. Then the shareholders will be called in. The boss will say, guys, look, while things were going well for you, you moved your money abroad. Just numbers on a screen, right? Now, be so kind as to recapitalize your banks. Well, basically, it's the same thing that's happening right now, isn't it? Take Domodedovo, for example, back and forth. There you go. He says, guys, how is it that when things are good for you, you act one way? But now it needs to be the other way around. Oh, you don't want it the other way around? Well then, sorry.
Well, when things were bad for them during the crisis, in 2008 or so, right? They got a lot of financial help back then, as far as I remember.
Now it's your turn to help with money.
And look, again, this ties right back in. Today there's news that fees for car owners are going up, for driver's licenses, for certain types of licenses, for certain vehicles, basically for all registration procedures, right? Yesterday there was news, and the Supreme Court even said we need to take a look at what's going on with the simplified tax system for small and medium businesses. Before this, there were similar news stories, and for me, they all fit together like a puzzle. The government is looking for ways to scrape up some cash. So it turns out they're scraping together small change wherever they can, while the banks are still sitting pretty.
It's time. It's time. But by the way, I have to say, what they did to small businesses was absolutely disgusting. Well, I'm a small business owner. I have an individual entrepreneur status. I have the simplified tax system because my annual turnover isn't that big. So they told me, well, okay, if your turnover goes above a certain amount, you'll pay not 5%, but 7%. All right, FF5. Let's make it 10. But why introduce VAT? I mean, you've created a huge problem for people. Why?
But it hasn't been passed yet. As far as I know, they're just considering it.
Yeah, it hasn't been passed. From January 1st,
It was introduced.
they introduced VAT, yeah, and it's without deduction. So I can't offset it. I just have to pay an extra 5% on top. But at the same time, of course, the complexity of accounting increases dramatically. Exactly. And a significant number of individuals are simply unable to manage this themselves, so they are compelled to engage the services of professional accounting firms. However, a substantial proportion of small businesses often do not possess sufficiently high profit margins to comfortably afford the considerable expenses associated with retaining such specialized accounting firms. So what do they start doing?
They leave.
They switch to cash, yeah? And there's nothing you can do about it. Like, you did this yourselves, you did it. First, you created conditions for them to legalize, and now you're driving them back into cash? Why? It's unclear.
Well, and I guess, for the remaining 4 minutes, I'd like to hear your opinion about what, as they say, these aren't my words, experts from Gazprom Bank, I think, if I remember correctly, call the anomalous strengthening of the ruble. And for some reason, they link this to the years 22 to 24. Why is it that now, for some reason, they decided to direct these surpluses specifically toward all sorts of processes that lead to this? What's your take on this? Why has the ruble strengthened so much?
Well, there are different kinds of resources, right? Roughly speaking, you can trigger inflation, or you can set a high interest rate. But you can't have both a high interest rate and inflation at the same time, because the economy would collapse. So what did they do? By strengthening the ruble, they reduced, actually, not just a little, but a lot, the impact of cost inflation on prices. Because, after all, the prices of imports in rubles have gone down. As a result, of course, prices keep rising for all sorts of other reasons, including tax increases, but still, less so. That's how it is. So, since they want to keep interest rates high at any cost, because, well, the goal our monetary authorities are pursuing is to prevent economic growth. That's why high rates are needed. But inflation has dropped, and now everyone is starting to say, let's lower the rates. So what have they already done? They announced that they're having budget problems. Next, accordingly, they're going to start devaluing the ruble under this pretext. They'll, well, take it up to 100, yeah. Like, that's acceptable. Actually, even the experts at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum have already been openly discussing this. We'll have 100. But if you go from 70 to 100, by the way, that's almost a 50% price increase. And that means...
On imports?
You can raise the rate again, even though everyone knows that the rate doesn't affect import prices at all, because those are determined solely by the ruble's exchange rate. So they've already pulled off this three-step maneuver in 2023. First, they devalued the ruble, but we didn't have any inflation. At the beginning of 2023, we had zero inflation.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Right. Well, there you go. So it's just pure sabotage, really. It's a real gem,
So the simple question is, my God, when is all this going to end? It reminds me of that show Our Apartment. What, where, when? You can't tell what's lying where or when all this will end. That's the question, of course, every single minute.
We'll talk about that in 20 years too.
That's good. Yeah, well.
By then, we'll definitely have an answer.
And the Shahs and Padishahs in general will support us, I hope.
We, lead a healthy lifestyle, do physical exercise, yeah? We don't drink, we don't smoke. Well, we don't drink, we don't smoke, I mean.
We don't smoke, yeah? I'd probably stop right there too. Thank you very much, Mikhail Leonidovich. Mikhail Khazin, economist, leads a healthy lifestyle and predicts economic events. And not just those, by the way, 20 years into the future.